Bom, pessoal, boa tarde a todos. Queria mais uma vez agradecer, né? Alguns rostos já são familiares, conhecidos. E então eu queria dizer que primeiro é um prazer, né, estar aqui com a professora Tanja Tajmel, da Concordia University do Canadá. Mas também para agradecer aqueles que estiveram acompanhando aí ao longo do semestre, todo o ciclo, né? A gente, na verdade, realizou 6 palestras e discutindo essa questão importante, que são as várias faces do risco, né, na sociedade contemporânea, né, enfatizando bem essa relação dialética que tem entre a ciência, a tecnologia e a sociedade, de que maneira que a educação ela é um elemento mediador importante para isso, tá? Tanja, I'm just thanking and explaining the role cycle because your speech was the sixth, the last one of the others that was starting at the beginning, and I am just telling that I was very happy to be here in this moment with your talk that closed this cycle, and emphasizing that the main idea is a way to see how the notion of risk and the idea that we live in a society, a contemporary society, where this kind of mix of science, technology and society that was very combined. It means that they entertain a kind of dialectical relationship. They offer many different kinds, some different phases of risk, and how education could be a way, a kind of a possibility to regulate, to mediate, or to prepare people to live in the best way in this kind of situation. Okay, especially today, the talk will be made by Professor Tanja. It's about equity, diversity, and inclusion in STEM. And STEM, in this sense, they configured a little bit this kind of dialectical relationship between these players: science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and the way we have to look to this relation in the sense of a kind of society that produce the more and more inegalities in this between the people that live it in. Just to give you some words about the Professor Tanja, I met her by a common friend, Professor Determinaram. In that moment, Professor Tanja was at Berlin University and working in this area of gender, inequality, and I was in a moment of organizing a world conference on physics education, and I invited her to be here to take part in a round table about this kind of subject that in physics is still not prevalent. It was not a major concern about physics, that thinking about gender, race, and other aspects of not the mainstream of the profile of the physicist and the physics knowledge. It was in 2016, yes, 3 years ago. And during this period of 3 years, Professor Tanja moved a little bit. She moved for another university in Austria, and nowadays she is in Montreal, in the Concordia University, working more closely to this kind of subjects, because Canada have a strong tradition in a multicultural perspective of knowledge. And I think for that reason, I'm very happy to have her here. And just to remember you that you are sending this talk by internet on the streaming. It means that when you speak, please ask for the microphone and don't forget to turn off your cell phones. This is the thing that I have to do just now because I forget to do before. Okay, thank you very much, Tanja, to be here to close our seminar with your presentation that I am sure to be a splendid discussion by this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maurizio. Thank you. It's an honor to be here and to speak here in this, I think, very innovative and very special seminar that you organized. So today I'm going to speak about equality and human rights in STEM education. And I always have to switch here the slides. And I would like to make the point for a change of paradigms in STEM education, because I see it necessary from the perspective of risk society that we need a certain change of paradigms in STEM education, and I will propose the human rights framework as a possibility of a normative framework, but also a framework where we can, which can give us orientation in the sense or in the context of STEM education. So my talk is structured in 3 parts. In the first part, I will speak about STEM education for scientific progress, which is actually the paradigm which exists, right? So still, I would say, still since the 50s, but still we have this paradigm that more STEM is important. And maybe at this point, I should also explain that I do not differ very much between science education and STEM education. I'm using the term STEM, which means science, technology, engineering and mathematics, as a synonym for science, just because the term STEM is now in the science education discourse used as a term to include all the fields of science, technology, and engineering. So I'm not talking about the difference of science and STEM, just to let you know. The second part will be about STEM education and risk society, so the idea of a new paradigm, and then the third part about human rights as a framework for STEM education in the risk society. Now, STEM education for progress, STEM education for national interest or as a national interest. This idea is born or was born especially in the 1950s or in the late 1950s when there was the Sputnik launch. Which was a shock for the whole Western world because the Russians, the Soviet Union was successfully launching the first satellite. And until this time, science was a subject as other subjects in the curriculum, in the school curriculum. But with Sputnik, science became a very important subject, and the Sputnik shock also triggered science education in the United States, and not only in the United States, but in the whole Western world, especially also in Western Europe, which was very much influenced by the US. So at this time, science education was focused on those who should be part of science, who should become participants of science or doing science, but did not do yet, namely the girls and the women. So at this time, people became aware that science was very much limited to a white male group, and that this is not sufficient in order to become a world leader in science research. The next shock which happened in history was in the 2000s, in the new millennium, the so-called PISA shock, a professional international student assessment, program for international student assessment. Why PISA shock? Because, I think now it's better with the microphone. Because students, for example, students in the United States, but also especially students in Middle Europe, in Germany. Germany is a very developed country, a very rich country, but students in these countries didn't perform as good as the country thought they are. So they performed not very well. And the difference between the PISA shock and the Sputnik shock was that Sputnik was a national interest, whereas PISA is organized by the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So we already see here that science education and science education is very much defined by PISA and by competencies and by performance and by skills. So science education was now very much an interest of economy, and economy is defining what we need in science education. And the goals of the OECD are not goals of, let's say, of emancipatory issues. Goals of OECD are, for example, that students should show a very good performance, that human resources have to be exploited, which means low performers, so-called low performers who are not performing very well, they have to be trained in order to serve the economy, in order to be exploitable. That means STEM education became somehow an economic means, something what you can trade. We see this shift from the national emancipatory interest to the economic interest of STEM education everywhere. For example, here, this is an example of Bayer and Monsanto. They are together now. And they are also talking about STEM education and youth outreach. And they are picturing, like here you see the girls, so they are showing girls and they are showing diversity, and they are talking about diversity. We need diversity in order to be competitive. And also all the big companies like Forbes, the magazine says diversity management is the key growth in today's fiercely competitive global marketplace. And Volkswagen also says making full use of the cultural diversity that exists within the group. This is necessary in order to become the top employer in the automotive sector. So we see the motive and the justification to deal with diversity is a justification of competition, a justification of economic development. Now, the low performers, I mentioned them already, they are a problem. From this perspective, from the economic perspective of diversity or of STEM education, low performers are a problem. And who are these low performers? We can characterize them. So, for example, these are factors for low performance. And if you are, or if a student is female with a weak socioeconomic background, which means poor, who is growing up in a family with only one parent in a rural area with migration background, with another language than the school language, no elementary education, and grade repetition, which means the student had to repeat a grade, then the probability for low performance is 83%. On the other hand, when you are male with a strong socioeconomic background, with a functioning family with both parents in an urban area, this is very important, no migration background, a good language proficiency as the school language, having attended elementary education, never repeated a grade, then your probability for low performance is 5%. Now we can now be provocative and ask, to which group of people, or for which group of people is school working very well? For the right group of people, right? And for the other school, the system of education is not working that well. There is one metaphor which is very often used to describe the situation in STEM, and this is the leaky pipeline. And I try to explain this metaphor now with the leaky pipeline. What does the leaky pipeline metaphor say? It says that we have a diversity of students, of course, a diversity of children, and these children are entering the education process, the STEM or science education process, and then by the time some students drop out. We are also speaking about dropout rates. They drop out and more drop out, and in the end there are only very few students leaving the pipeline, successfully leaving the STEM education pipeline. There wouldn't be any problem with this pipeline when there were the same composition of students at the end of the pipeline as at the beginning. Nobody is saying that everybody has to become a physics professor. The problem is that the composition of students is changing. So there are students dropping out, but only students from certain groups. And of course, we are also considering the intersectional factors, which means we are considering race intersecting with gender, intersecting with social class. And this is very interesting. Now the reaction from the performance-oriented paradigm perspective from STEM education is, okay, we have to fix the leaks. We have to fix the leaks so that nobody can drop out, so that everybody stays in the pipeline. That means, from the perspective of the students, those who drop out, they have to assimilate. They have to stay in the pipeline. They have to take over the beliefs, the values of the pipeline, the heroes of the pipeline, everything, the culture of this pipeline. But what we are not doing from this paradigm, we are not questioning the pipeline itself. We are still not thinking about building another pipeline, building more pipelines. We are still sticking to this concept of the pipeline. I try to show this now in a different way, and I'll try to translate it to PISA. Here we have, on the right side, we have the 6 levels of PISA performance. The first level is the best level, and the 6th level is, it doesn't work with the screen. It only works here? Yeah. And the 6th level, these are the low performers. And this is the population of students. And normally from the PISA point of view, these students distribute to the different levels of performance. So here we see those who exit the pipeline successfully, the small group, and here we see those who drop out, the low performers. And the educational measures, that means fixing the leaks, means that we try to lift all these low performers by compensatory measures, by assimilating measures, in order to fit into these performance levels, in order to fit into this concept of performance. We tried this since 20 years or 30 years, and we see it doesn't work very well, because the underperformance of certain groups is still there. Now, what does that have to do with risk society? I think this concept of science education, this performance-oriented concept of science education, economic-driven concept of science education, is very much a modernist thinking, where science and technology is progress, unquestioned progress. Science is considered to solve problems. Science is a national interest. The paradigms of science education are to develop global skills, but from a neoliberal perspective. Neoliberal values means global skills that you can sell everywhere, in China and in Canada and in Brazil. And the concept of diversity and equity is embedded in this paradigm, which means we only look at diversity from this perspective. So we only think about how can we fit this diversity into this paradigm. The risk society asks for something else. We have to shift the paradigm, because we also have to see, and I think this is very much a part of the understanding of risk society, that science and technology is part of the problem in a certain sense. Science and technology cause problems. Risk society requires reflexivity and reflective thinking of the actors in science and technology. And diversity and equity has to be seen through a different lens and not through the performance-oriented lens. In preparation for this talk, I was reading the Portuguese introduction of Maurizio, and unfortunately, I don't speak Portuguese, but thanks to Google Translate, I could translate this sentence of Maurizio, and he says, risk awareness must move from the local to the global level. And that's very true. But we are talking about a different global level. We are not talking about because PISA would say, yes, we are in the global level. We are thinking globally about competencies, but we have to think about a different global level. So what globality are we talking about? This, for example, is an example of globality, the Fridays for Futures, the climate change. And we have to think, how does science education or the field of science contribute to climate change? How does science education contribute to this situation and to the different risks. And this is a question that we as science educators are not familiar with, because it means that we have to investigate critically our own profession. So there is a reflexive approach necessary when we have to accept that science and technology can be part of the problem. Now I come to the second part of the talk, science education or STEM education in the risk society, and I'm asking the question, does STEM education have politics? And I'm borrowing this sentence from Langdon Winner and his book, Do Artifacts Have Politics? Langdon Winner is a historian, science and technology historian, and he investigated especially the US railway system, and he found very early that technologies can be used in ways that enhance power and enhance social power relations and privilege some over others. I will give you two examples that are also studied or were also studied by Langdon Winner. The two examples are the Moses bridges. Robert Moses was a construction, actually he was in the New York construction department, and he decided about constructing bridges and highways in New York and Long Island. And the other example is the tomato harvester. Langdon Winner distinguished between two kinds of technical arrangements and the politics of these technical arrangements. The ones are bridges and harvesters, and the other ones are inherently political technologies like railway systems and nuclear powers. So nuclear power, to decide if a society goes with nuclear power or not, is an inherently political decision. Whereas to decide if you build this bridge or another bridge becomes a political decision, but it's not an inherently political decision. Now, Robert Moses, he was building, or he was leading, how to say, he was the official who was deciding which bridges should be built and which highways should be built in New York. And there is one bridge, for example, this one, and we see this bridge is, this is the highway to Long Island. Long Island is a very rich community in New York, so all the rich New Yorkers have their houses in Long Island. And Robert Moses built the overpass like this. Normally you would say, okay, this is a bridge. Does this bridge have politics? It has politics because only cars, only private cars could pass through this bridge. But buses, local buses, could not pass the bridge. And the black people are going by local bus and not by private cars. And this was actually his intention. So he was very explicit about that. We need to build the bridges low enough so that the black people cannot pass the bridge. So this is a very indirect discrimination, but this is a building, a bridge, that contributes to social inequity. When we think about science education, we are talking about bridges, we are building bridges, we have the gravitational force, we are doing all about bridges, but we do not learn about how bridges can influence society. Another example, the tomato harvester. The tomato harvester was invented also in the 60s, and the interesting thing is, so it brought a lot of advantages because people didn't have to pick the tomatoes. It was very quick, so you could have for the big fields, and it was a very big harvesting, a very, very quick harvesting. But the problem was that the normal tomatoes, they smashed very quickly. So for an apparatus like this, like the harvester, you need tomatoes that have a hard skin, that do not smash very quickly, and they should ideally have the same size. We all know it. These tomatoes. Unfortunately, these tomatoes don't taste as good as the other tomatoes, that they invented these tomatoes, and the invention of the tomato harvester went hand in hand with the California Institute of Technology. They developed the fitting tomatoes for this harvester. They breeded the tomatoes that fit to this harvester. The consequence was you don't need the people anymore, and you don't need the small farmers anymore. When we are teaching and studying genetic modifications, gene technologies, then we are talking about everything, but we are not talking that much about the social and the socio-political effects and impacts of such inventions. So these are two examples how technologies can make social difference and can trigger power relations. Now the interesting thing is, what do we not teach? What do we not teach? And here I would like to refer to a term which was invented by Robert Proctor, the agnotology. What do we not know? Agnotology is the cultural induced ignorance, or the cultivation of not knowing, the cultivation of ignorance. Robert Proctor studied in the 1990s, 1995, he studied the research of the tobacco industry, and he investigated and discovered that tobacco industry invested billions of dollars to obscure the fact that smoking is dangerous. So they produced research which showed that smoking is not dangerous. And they hid the fact that smoking is dangerous. So this kind of non-researching, or this kind of hiding certain facts, he called agnotology. And I would like to borrow this term for science education as well. And I say, and this is what my argument, I say that also in science education, we are hiding certain facts. Not deliberately, but we are hiding, we are not speaking about certain very important topics. This is an example of my own research, what I did in this context. I was investigating the discourse, or I was investigating science education research in Germany and Austria. The community of science educators, or let's say physics and chemistry educators, is a very big one in Germany, because physics didactics and chemistry didactics have a long tradition in Germany. And I was investigating the publications of the Society for Chemistry and Physics Education, and was asking to which extent are social inequity and social critical questions an issue in STEM education research. So I was not looking at the school and the science education in school, but at science education research. I did this by employing discourse analysis, and I was studying a lot of abstracts, a lot of titles and keywords of papers published between 1973 until 2015. And I was categorizing the keywords as indicators for certain discourse. You can see keywords as indicators for a certain discourse. So for example, when you have a keyword like performance, then this keyword indicates an output-oriented discourse. When you have a keyword like discrimination, then this keyword indicates social critical discourse. So these are the categories: society, output, critical, and physical content. For example, when you have a keyword optics, then it only indicates a physical discourse, not a society discourse, not a critical discourse. Okay, now here you see the relative frequency, and here you see the papers over the years, and you see that after 2000 was PISA, right? Then it took some years, and then all the one-third of the publications of physics and chemistry research are about competence, skills, performance. One-third. It would be interesting to do this with NARST publications or something like that. Migration. Migration is a keyword for a social discourse. Not a topic at all. I must say that this are publications from myself. So it's really not a topic at all. Ecology. Not a topic at all in science education research. War and peace does not exist. We know that big universities and research institutes are funded by the military, are funded by the Ministry of Defense. Yeah. And here we see we have the discussion in the 80s. This was the Cold War. But then after that, no problem at all. It seems as if we don't have any war anymore, right? The peaceful earth. And discrimination, equality, inequity, nothing. This is the paradigm. We focus on the functionality of STEM, we focus on the performance, but we do not bother with social issues. Now, the third part of my talk, human rights as framework for STEM education in the risk society. I would like to give you now a juxtaposition of the two perspectives. The one perspective was the economic perspective. I call it the economic perspective. We can also call it the neoliberal perspective because all the values are very neoliberal values. The exchangeability of skills and competencies. The economic perspective includes STEM as for economic progress, diversity as a human resource. We have to tap these human resources. The individuals shall fit into STEM. We are investing a lot into making them fit, fixing the leaks. And the focus is on the performance and on the employability of the students. The other perspective is the humanistic perspective. I call it humanistic perspective or also human rights perspective. This perspective centers the human being and not the performance or the science itself. The economic perspective centers the science as progress, whereas the humanistic perspective centers the human being, the individual. And from this perspective, science is a common good. That means it doesn't belong to anybody. Everybody has the right to participate in science. Science has to be acceptable to everybody. Now, if we see the Climate for Future demonstrations, and especially also the indigenous participants of these demonstrations, then we see science is not acceptable for everybody. Everybody has the right to be educated and to participate in science. And, very important, this right is independent from economic exploitation, which means even if we don't need any more skilled workers, we still have to provide high qualitative science education. So actually, this perspective is much more sustainable than the other perspective. I honestly, I don't understand why the whole or big parts of the field of science education are so fond of this economic perspective, because the economic perspective says when we have enough workers, we don't need the science education anymore, so we can cut the funding for science education. This perspective says we need science education even if we have enough workers. Coming back to leaky pipeline, what does that mean? Some groups are kept out. So from the paradigm of the non-economic perspective, some groups are kept out. Not some groups drop out, they are kept out. That means there is an active process of keeping them out. Agnotology, right? Some groups are, maybe this person here is somebody who is very much interested in social equity, but he or she doesn't find anything in science education or in science which fits his interests, right? Or maybe this person is interested in arts, and he doesn't find anything which fits the interests. And of course, they are also interested in science, but science is so rigid. It's the discipline is not very flexible. It's the interdisciplinarity is, everybody says it's important, but it's not very flexible. Also the graduate programs, I don't know about Brazil, but graduate programs are not so flexible. now you already know this picture, and this is from the first paradigm, from science as performance-oriented, and now we are having the human rights perspective, the humanistic perspective, which means we start one step earlier. We say, these are different people, but society makes difference. Difference is something which is produced by society. At the beginning, we are all the same. We are human beings. And therefore, I also use the term equality and not equity. Equality in the sense that everybody is equal because we all are human beings. Equity means we already have a difference and we try to treat everybody fair. That's the term equity. But equity already accepts a kind of difference. Now, human beings, and when you take a look at the Human Rights Declaration, then you see in the human rights, they only speak about humans, human beings, individuals. They don't speak about women and men. They speak about discrimination, and discrimination on grounds of gender, class, race, body, and so on is forbidden. So this is the only aspect where women and men come into the into the human rights. And it's very easy to understand that the differences, the social differences, are subject to change. They are changing. For example, some years ago, we were talking about, or we were sure about, we didn't question the dualism of gender, right? Male and female. Now, in recent years, we develop that further. We say, no, it's not only two genders, there are more genders, is maybe a third gender, or gender is affluent. So this is not fixed anymore. That means the difference, or how we categorize and how we differ people, changes with the time. It's a social process. The interesting question is now, we still have this inequality, these disparities, and we have the difference. And we are now asking, how is this difference produced? How is it made? And there are three levels. I'm now referring to intersectional analysis. I don't want to explain it too much here. But there are three levels which are distinguished. The identity level, the level of representation. Representation means the culture, we could say the subject-specific culture, and the structural level. So, for example, identity construction, you all know from Simone de Beauvoir, you are not born as a woman, you become a woman, right? So this is the kind of identity construction. Representation would mean who is considered a good scientist, who is considered to be a famous scientist, a hero. Whom do we see in the textbooks? It's always Albert Einstein, right? They are all old and dead, mostly. It's a pity, but that's the scientist. That's a picture of scientists we have. And the structural level would say, for example, is there a gender pay gap in science? Do female scientists get less paid than male scientists? This would be a structural level. Or is the educational system open to everybody or only to a specific group? Now, again, I don't want to spend too much time with the three levels, but the interesting thing is, if we consider that difference is a product of society, then we are not interested in the individual's difference. We are not studying the diversity of the individuals. We are studying how this diversity is produced. So we are shifting our focus of study from the individuals to these processes here. How do we produce difference? And these people have access to science education, and these people have no access to science education, which means we do not speak about disparities in performance, but disparities in access. Right? So we are not thinking about fixing the leaks or about measures for diverse students to lift them. We are questioning the whole pipeline. This is the pipeline. This is the bridge. This is Moses' bridge, right? And we are asking now the height of the bridge. And from the perspective of science education, the question is, how does STEM education contribute to this? So what are we doing in STEM education, or what are we not doing? What is the agnotology of STEM education? Now, the human rights are characterized by a structure, by a 4A scheme. It's called 4As because all these structural elements start with an A. It's the availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. And if all 4As are fulfilled, then the right to education is fulfilled. For science education, it's the same. Availability means, for example, there is free education, there is infrastructure, there are buildings, books, materials, there is qualified teacher education, very important. Accessibility means students can enter the school, but not only physical accessibility, but also socioeconomic accessibility, which means they can afford school, they understand the teachers, and the whole science education is accessible also in a cultural way. Acceptability, this is the most interesting one, is that science curricula and lessons should be unbiased, free of discrimination, and acceptable for all students. So discriminative education is not regarded as acceptable for students. And adaptability means the system of science education is flexible enough to adapt to changes in society. For example, in the 2 years ago, when there were the refugees from Syria coming to Germany, alone in Berlin we had 90,000 refugees. In all over Germany there were about 900,000 refugees. The system, the educational system, had a huge challenge because these refugees didn't speak German, of course not, and most of these refugees spent the last years of their life in refugee camps where they didn't have any education, sometimes any education. So a lot of refugees were illiterate. They were 10 years old, but they couldn't read and write. Or went then in Arabic, but not in German. So this was a situation where the German government, and especially the city of Berlin, had to immediately react on this situation, and they opened new classes, they trained new teachers in order to meet this emergency situation. In the framework of this 4A scheme, I had the honor to work in a group which met in October 2018 in Berlin at the Academy of Sciences, and we adopted the Declaration of the Right to STEM Education. And among these collaborators or supporters of this declaration is Nada Al-Nashif. She's Assistant Director General of the UNESCO. And we are now about to publish a book with proceedings of this meeting next summer. And these are excerpts of the right to science education. So actually the right to science education is an basis on the right to education, but makes explicit science education as a part of education. And we regard this as important nowadays in times of climate change and in times of risk society. I highlighted certain parts of this right to science education. The right to science education includes the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress, including the right to contribute to scientific progress. The goal of science education is of acquiring knowledge as an end in itself, and not acquiring knowledge in order to be exploitable. And important is the availability of and accessibility to science education and the component of acceptability. The next part of the right to science education says, science education needs to follow an integrated approach with the general vision of science as a common good. And the next part, the quality of science education. Science education must be acceptable to learners. Acceptability includes the knowledge, content, and research. knowledge and research which reproduce inequality are therefore regarded as not acceptable. Now, when we think about the tomato harvester, we think about the bridges, we think about bias in artificial intelligence. We know that artificial intelligence produces inequity. Then we can say, okay, we have to include this in science education because this is actually an important part of science education. And I think this is the end of my talk. So these are the 3 parts of my talk. Thank you very much for your attendance and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanja, for your presentation. I was a little bit astonished, impacted by the things that I know, but when they face me like a mirror. Okay, it's now open for the questions, the comments. Please don't be ashamed. It's possible to speak in Portuguese, and I help the translations. Just speak your name and use microphone. Okay.
Caio Dantas, aposentado, retired from the Institute of Mathematics and Statistics. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting, and the problems that you mentioned, I think, are at the front of what is happening nowadays. One difficulty that I see is how we can mobilize the community in order to change the way we teach so that we can take into account the problems mentioned, as Ulrich Beck and has studied. We worked last year in a reorganization of the study here at University of São Paulo. I see one problem, particularly that we face here, is that our campus is very spread out. And we departed from the principles that were set up when the university was created. We were supposed to have a central area where library, theater, several things could put people together. And I see as a necessity that this is done. And I have worked in another paper that I have sent to the Institute mentioning that this problem of the spatial distribution is a prerequisite for the study of new paradigm, for, as you have mentioned. And one question that I would like to bring to you is the following. Our methods of evaluation, of production, of professors, for promotion, and for obtaining new assignments are based on publications, mainly. I would say 90% probably. How would you consider how this could be changed, or do you think it should be changed first? And if so, how could we do it so that we work along those lines that you mentioned?
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is a very important question. I agree, or I would say the methods, how we evaluate everything now in the world is performance-oriented, and it comes from a neoliberal idea and also the evaluation in universities and academic evaluations. We also know that 50% of the papers that are published will never be cited, will never be read by anybody, but you need, or the professors and researchers need to publish, so it's a kind of a machine, publishing machine. This is a culture, an academic culture. Bourdieu would say the academic culture is reproducing itself, and if you want to change it, you have to bring something from outside, because in itself, the culture won't change. So the changes need to come from outside, and of course, this is policy. Here comes policy into play, and politics, I would also say. So for example, in Canada, they are, when you are applying for a funding project, they are evaluating your publications, but they are also evaluating your community engagement. This is quite new, and I think this is important, to see other qualities, and not only qualities in scientific output, because this is really a self-reproductive idea of quality. And I would also like to refer to the disciplines and to the separation of the disciplines you mentioned, and how this separation is translated even in a local separation of disciplines. This is also definitely a problem, to have, let's say, to have physics or sciences on one part and the cultural studies on completely another part, and the students from these two faculties will never meet. That's not innovative, I would say.
Outras perguntas? Tá facinho de passar o microfone.
Thank you for your talk. I was a member of a task force that Professor Caio just mentioned. Myself, I'm retired, but now I'm a visiting professor here at the IEA. And part of my research line crosses with Montreal, and I used to go across the Concordia, the University of Concordia every day, so wow. Welcome. I enjoyed very much your talk. I only want you to expand a little bit on two other things, or 2 points that you mentioned. One is that you equate the first model to the neoliberal, a kind of neoliberal approach. I might say that now in Brazil, nowadays, we are facing something much worse than neoliberal, because a neoliberal equates to some kind of modernism, and we are having a version of neoliberalism that equates to pre-enlightenment thought, which is anti-science. And this is precisely on the opposite direction, that thinking that science education is a right for everyone. And the other thing is that the issue of equality, the assumption for this approach, which I share, is that the educational system is for promoting equality. And we have several instances of understanding, or at least explaining some of the outcomes of the educational system as promoters of precisely the opposite, of inequity, and in many cases, the crystallization of inequality in society. Because we do have in Brazil, it's a quite polar structure in which the social perversion is very strong. For instance, when I say that to foreign fellows, everybody cannot understand why poor people in Brazil go to the public system of elementary and high school education, get low quality education, and then are not capable of getting into the public universities, which are in Brazil for free. And so the middle and upper classes are more, the probability of getting into the public universities, which are for free, is somewhat guaranteed, or at least the next generation of the power system is guaranteed by education. So, please, I would love you to elaborate on these 2 points.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I have to completely admit that, of course, the neoliberalism or the neoliberal idea, what is happening now in Brazil is, to my knowledge, a different one. I don't want to relativize the scientific knowledge. So when we speak about scientific knowledge or science has to be acceptable to everybody, this is not meant that we are also accepting, or let's say evangelical thoughts, or those who are neglecting Darwin and evolution are acceptable, because actually they are talking about social inequity. So the new ideas or scientific ideas have to be acceptable, but the common characteristics of science has to be that it's not reproducing inequity. So this is a very important fact. Now, how to realize that? We are now starting with a project which is called Decolonizing Light. It's about decolonization in physics, and Maurizio is collaborating in this project. We will work a little bit about that in this week also. And what we are trying to do is we try to accommodate indigenous knowledges in this project, in the context of light. What we are not trying to do is to include the indigenous knowledge into science and somehow to try to making indigenous knowledge fit into science, in the sense that maybe they explain something better than science explains. But we just try to accept that there is another kind of knowledge. But physics is as it is. I would say it wouldn't make sense to say, okay, we have to change the physical content. We have to change, let's say, isn't the velocity of light 300,000 kilometers per second, as it is for 300,000 kilometers per second, and light is an electromagnetic wave, to our knowledge and whatsoever. But not every culture sees the same phenomena as important. Not every culture or every knowledge system thinks about explanation in this way. So the Western scientific paradigm wants to explain everything. We have this idea of explaining everything and asking what is the reason. But this is not in every knowledge culture. What is the solution? What can we do? My option is to put these knowledges parallel together, to give every knowledge a position, to make or to not to decrease the only knowledge authority of the Western knowledge, and to say, okay, we accept different knowledges, we see the different representatives of the knowledges, we redefine academic knowledge, but we do not try to change physics content. But what we have to change is the application of this knowledge, of scientific knowledge. So for example, when it comes to building pipelines or building observatories, astronomical observatories, like in Mauna Kea in Hawaii, for example, of course we have to think about there is a population. For this population, this mountain is a holy mountain. It's a spiritual mountain, and so on. So science has to consider its borders as well. This is maybe the way we could go. But definitely we should not go the way to relativize everything. More to say, okay, there are different knowledges. The second question was about equality. And the quality of STEM education, and that its focus is on equality. Equality. Now I forgot what exactly was it.
The question was trying to consider the possibility of having the educational system as a promoter of inequality instead of the educational system as a promoter of inequality, which is a Bourdieusian hypothesis. But my point is that in Brazil we have a quite clear example of that possibility, given the perversion that that relates in a sort of a very differential approach, the public system of education before the university and the public university in Brazil, which is for free but not for the people. That was my...
I would also say that also in this case, Bourdieu would say, well, the educational system will produce that what is regarded as education and will reproduce it. I know very little about the system in Brazil, and Maurizio told me a little bit. So it seems that to reach real equality, you have to start very early, and sometimes only changing the education is not enough. There is much more than education. There is infrastructure. There is not education is. You cannot change the world only by education. So maybe this is the answer to that. That even if you try with education to reach equality, there are other factors which need to be changed, or which might not be able to change.
Pina.
Olá, meu nome é Pina. Thank you, Professor Tania, for your talk. I'd like also to congratulate Mauricio, because I guess this talk was a perfect conclusion for the conferences. And actually, my question was not. I don't know if it's a question, because actually, when I saw the other talks, as Professor Audia and Professor Normar, they're here also. We talked about the importance of the STEM education and the importance of the paying attention on the diversity and all the risks involved in the risk society, in all our decisions. And now with your talk, saying about the diversity and the equality, human rights, problems that we're facing. And when I see that Belgium took off philosophy from their curriculum, in Brazil is not necessary either. In the US, they took off philosophy many years ago. It's not obligatory. I see, well, we're talking about ethics. And it's important to talk about this in science courses. But aren't we going backwards in the education system? And maybe my question is, shouldn't we in the science field be working more with the human fields? Because I don't know if we're going somewhere, because now we have this, all these conferences were so mind-blowing. We talked about so many things that are really important, but when we see what is actually happening in the education system, I don't know, maybe it's a little upsetting. So are you, well, you all big professors in the academy, are you seeing a movement to, I don't know, to integrate this discussion, not only in science, because maybe in science became a necessity to discuss ethics and all of this, but we stopped discussing this in philosophy classes at school. So,
yeah. So I myself was science teacher in Austria, and in Germany I was training science teachers at Humboldt University, so I know a little bit about the educational system there. I know more about the German education system than the Canadian, because the Canadian is very provincial in the sense that every province has its own and it's complicated. And I do not see the changes now. I did not see the changes then. All the changes were driven and are driven, and I mean now the neoliberal idea in the European sense compared to the education system that we had before the 1990s, because there was a huge change of education systems in East Germany, in Germany, after the 1990s, after the Berlin Wall. Because after that, we can say about Soviet Union whatever we want, but the Soviet Union was one power corrective to the United States. Let's say it like that. And after that, whole Europe arrived in the neoliberal world. And the science education itself, like the OECD, invented PISA, and all the science education is, of course, also a part of lobbyists' work. So what is needed and what is important. And it's not surprising that PISA is testing mathematics, science, language, because you have to read language, and computer skills. They are not testing ethics. They are not testing arts or creativity or whatever. So these are not skills that are regarded as important skills. They are not testing individuality, right? You should be able to solve this problem. Everything is about solving problem in a very functional way. And if we have the artificial intelligence and the machine learning developed, we don't need the problem solvers anymore, right? So this is a very narrow understanding of science, and this was translated into the science classroom. Then, of course, there was this movement of context-related science, so science in context, physics in context, chemistry in context, but also the contexts where context, I would say, application of science in order to make it more tasteful for the students. But it's not really a context, a problematic context with ethical questions, because the normal physics teacher is not an ethics expert. So there is the training of the teachers, which is already a problem. And in my time, when I was at Humboldt University, they had also a change of curriculum, of teacher curriculum. Before, in the first version, teachers could combine, for example, English or language and science. Now, with the new curriculum, only mathematics and physics or chemistry and physics is going very well together with the lessons and with everything. But it's nearly impossible to combine philosophy and physics, English and physics, or any other humanities and physics. This is a loss of intellectual property, I would say. This is a loss of intellectual development of physics teachers. And of course, when you have made these changes, it's very difficult to go back. It's very difficult. Now you have physics teachers that are trained in mathematics and physics. They don't know about Immanuel Kant. They don't know about anything about any ethics. They cannot discuss about social equity. These physics teachers are training physics students. What do we expect? They will have students who are interested exactly in this kind of science. So the science or this will reproduce itself. These students, the small group, they are interested in this kind of narrow thinking science. But all the other students are not interested. I think if we would change, now this is a fantasy, but if we would change that and if we would really make it more interdisciplinary, maybe we will lose some students, those students who would be more interested in this very straightforward science career. But we will win other students. We will get the interest of many more other students. So I think science, the field of science should open. We cannot make it worse, I would say. It's too narrow.
Hernani.
Hi, well, Professor Tanya, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Hernani. I'm a grad student at the Graduate School of Education here. And my question is very related to your last answer. We saw in Brazil, maybe 10 years ago, a movement of affirmative actions for bringing in the university minorities, a large amount of minorities. And one thing that we saw as a very, very rich gain with those affirmative actions was that once the minorities came inside the science production, new kinds of research questions arose. Questions that people from the privileged lives will never ask. But in the other hand, we have this technocrat argument that science is for progress, so science is given, and we need to form this labor force. And if we try to deviate the research questions for those new perspectives, we will not have new planes, like flight planes. We will not have new technologies, which I strongly disagree, of course. But against those technocrats, I used to argument that you can only include access to knowledge if you provide some access to knowledge producers. So as you have this experience from Germany, Austria, and now Canada, how does the affirmative actions work on those countries, and how can Brazil learn from your experience?
Thank you. Yes, so this is a very good question. I'm not sure if these countries can learn, or Brazil can learn from these countries, because these countries maybe could learn from Brazil. There is no affirmative action in Canada, to my knowledge. In Quebec, there is, for example, when you... no, there is not a quota for students for Quebec universities, if I'm not wrong. But I didn't hear about that. I personally think that affirmative actions can do a good job. So as you said, they can change the research questions, they can change the research focus. And I also know this argument that what if we change research, maybe the planes don't fly anymore, or everything will become worse. Maybe we should think about it in a different way. Planes will fly, but maybe planes will use their fuel in another way. Because planes are not only good, they also do bad things. We know it now, right? Flight shaming and everything. Now nobody dares to say, I'm going by plane. There are good and bad things about planes, and there are good and bad things about all other technologies. Like antibiotics. Of course antibiotics are necessary, but when we see the misuse of antibiotics, or the antibiotics in the mass industry, in the meat industry, now we have resistances which are very problematic. So maybe these facts could have been anticipated if we would have more diverse research teams. The research teams are still very homogeneous. And if you have more different brains thinking about the problem, then it could only be better and not worse. It will be different, definitely, but it will be something which is acceptable to more people. Because now when we think about planes, about flying the planes, who is benefiting from planes? There are a lot of people in the world that don't have any benefits from planes, but only the climate change, because they don't fly for their whole life. They cannot fly, they cannot afford it. So the problems we are talking about are very much middle class, rich problems. And of course it will have a shift, but it will have a shift into the direction of the human rights. Yeah. Was that everything? I don't know if you...
How can we learn?
Yes.
Experience. The other is how to counter-argument the technocrat.
Yeah.
Which I think
Yes, this is the counter-argument. And when we speak about affirmative action, maybe this is also a point what is interesting. I think it does not work. I mean, it also works bringing people of underrepresented groups into academy, into research. And by this, bringing different worldviews and different backgrounds. This is important. But it's also about changing the way of research, changing what you said, that everything is about publication. We should take the chance when we bring the people into research that we also change the research and the quality, how we measure quality of research. Because measuring publications is also a kind of quantitative measuring of quality. Everything is quantitative evaluation. Also in science education research, the competencies, they like to study these competencies because this is all quantitative empirical research. So you are basically you're calculating all the time and you get numbers. But that's not enough, not in the risk society.
Thank you.
Mais perguntas? Temos tempo ainda. Cláudia, aqui na frente, uma pessoa. Acho que pode até deixar o microfone mais para cá. Aquela.
My name is Prislaine. Thank you very much, Professor Tanya, for your talk and sharing your thoughts. I work here at the USP Women's Office, which is supposed to work with gender-based violence inside university. And, well, we have a lot of problems, I think, in almost all three levels you said about representation, structure, and also identity construction. But I would like to share, when we think about intersectionality, and we have now quotas also at University of São Paulo, is very recent for our story. I was a student here 20 years ago. And now the university is really changing. And we have to also to consider the 4 A's that you mentioned, and I think we also have problems in all 4 A's over here. And I would like to share a study we did 2 years ago with all grad and undergrad students here at University of São Paulo. This study is called Interactions at USP. And we asked about experiencing violence, discrimination, and humiliation over your years at the university. And what I would like to share now is that we find a kind of a stair. In the first steps of the stair, a huge stair, we always find men's, white, and from rich classes. They all report less experiences of violence, of discrimination, and of humiliation among those years at the university. And at the highest steps of the stairs, we find women, black and poor. And even in high levels, we find non-binary persons who identify themselves as non-binaries. So we have kind of 80% of those peoples reporting having experienced violence inside academia. So our pipeline is leaking a lot also, even here at the University of São Paulo. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh yes, that is a very important issue. So the leaks of the pipeline, what you mentioned, are not only the leaks because somebody is not interested in the way STEM is conducted, but also because it's a very hostile field also. Yeah.
Perguntas ainda? São 3:30 ainda, a gente está longe do final. Podemos ter repeteco, sem dúvida.
Sorry, I'm going to add something that I forgot in the first one, in my first intervention. And that is your proposal of the 4 A's. I think it's extremely interesting because we are used to deal with inequality as something dimensional and quantitative. And that approach is only the first 2 A's. The other 2 A's are a type of a subjective, qualitative inequality that has to do mostly with the underground differential treatment, the segregation, the discrimination, which is not upfront revealed. It's something that is very subtle and is much harder to fight against. I don't know if I mentioned, but my original field is health. And I had the chance to participate in this seminar when the Risk Society was discussed regarding health and what we call collective health here. And we have in health an approach that the inequality of the risk has to do with the social determination and historical determination process. But once the person gets into the system, normally people think that they are enabled to be treated equally. But we have rich evidence that shows that that's not the case. Especially recently in Brazil, in the past 10 years, we expanded a lot the national health system, and we almost have universal coverage at the primary health care level. But then people get into the system and they are submitted to several different ways of being treated unequally in ways that, eventually they have access to a given exam, but 3-4 months after, on a very long line, or even the humane quality of the care is different if someone has a private insurance coverage, or if it is only someone that is a poor person that has only the minimal coverage of the health system. I know that every health system in Canada, in Great Britain, which are the 2 models that we have taken as a source of inspiration for our system in Brazil, have similar problems. But here, that's extreme. And so the major topic of structural inequality that applies to health, my suggestion or hypothesis or proposes that applies to education to the same extent. We do have a qualitative inequality embedded into the educational system in Brazil. Mm-hmm. That's why I enjoy so much your 4A approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah.
Alguém mais? Eu tenho duas perguntas, estou guardando para o final aqui, vocês podem... Tá bom, então vou fazer uma delas e aí, quem sabe, vocês pensam melhor. Tanya, for me, I think that when you speak about globality and the problems that, in fact, we have the OCDE and others big institutions that are pushed us in direction to the idea that the good scenario for capital is where you can move it, people and productions and anything that was needed for the economic development was no local trace. It means that we try to see the world as it was just the same and equal system. But some of these global perceptions sometimes it's important for you to see differences. For example, nowadays it's very complicated not to understand, for example, the ways of life or the other possibilities of life that we have, not only in the place where you are, but in other places. I try to understand, and it was not just me, but there are some studies that show that the integration of the networks, the televisions, and all the ways that we get information could be a way to explain the big amount of protest and the communities that applied for more freedom, more democracy, and others. This is just to try to make a kind of contradiction between the idea of globality. It means that there is a bad side. It means that the use of global perspective that could improve the ways to give neoliberalism a very powerful and the only direction that we could have. It means that for me there is a kind of dialectical, but it's a kind of to see that globality and locality could be better and worse. It depends the way you take the things. You take in the sense that it was not to say all global is better, it's worse, it's bad, and all local is good. But because this is a way that for me it's very easy to propose and to get followers. You know, people that agree with you, because you take a very complex problem, you just put the things in one side and in the others, and you offer, and you say what side you are. You are again or poor global, or you are again against or poor local. And I think this is a little bit the scenario that we have here in the kind of the discussion, the political ways, in the cultural, in the education. It means that we present the scenario and you say people what side you are. And for me, it's normal. There is no side, because in my perception, we improve our view of the world with the local perceptions, that we are more aware about the qualities to have diversity, as for example the ways Hernani have presented, new questions, new approaches. But we have good things also in have the perspective that some part of the world we share, and you have to take care together. How you think that it's possible to theorize it or to think about these two sides without making that dichotomy? You understand a little bit?
Yeah.
This is a dilemma that I face it normally when I try to change sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and it's definitely a dilemma, because of course we are thinking globally, and of course the human rights are global. This is a global idea. About locality, maybe I would say that what we are doing about science, when we think and when we produce science and when we produce new technologies, and the science education is just the first step for producing new technologies, right? Then we somehow have to localize or have to take into consideration the local as well. So to contextualize it with the local. Let's say, let's come back to the bridge of Robert Moses. The bridge is the bridge, which is a global knowledge of a bridge. And the same bridge will do no harm in another place. But the fact that this bridge is where it is, and where the private cars are possessed by white people, and the black people are going by bus, exactly in this locality, makes this bridge a political phenomenon, because it is localized in this certain part, at a certain time, in this certain local locus of Long Island and New York. So the bridge makes sense, makes a political sense in this, or the impact of the bridge in a political way is only given by localizing it. And I think this is what we also can do with other scientific effects. We study the science, but then we have to somehow think about the local, the location of the science and the effect of the science and its impact on the location.
When you are talking, I remember now. I get the proposition that you have made for Naumar, that in your actual research you are trying to combine. It seems that we have the official science, the official physics, but you have also the knowledge from the indigenous people. For me, this is a kind of these two sides. For example, when you think in the sense of globality, I think there is. It's possible to see physics and science, official science in general, as a global movement. In the sense that the speed of light that it's considered as the limit for anyone. But when you try to contextualize it, it means that this is not the science in itself, but I have to offer science for this community, for a small city that has a tradition in trying to deal with the world in another perspective. It means that kind of indigenous knowledge. To myself, I think it's completely possible to try to show both sides. It means that the universal science or the universal perspective is a little bit like that, but if you try to understand this specific phenomena of life or of the culture, you can give more than one explanation. And I think it's valuable also for other kinds of big systems, for example, the human rights. Sometimes you have the big, beautiful and small number of principles of human rights. But when you try to confront this with local practices and traditions, sometimes you clash each other. I remember 30 years ago, it was a movement where we tried to understand how the human rights could be imposed to some level of small practices that clash each other's. I think this is another case. It means there is a global perspective, but they must be implemented locally. And I think we are not enough prepared as intellectual to deal with these two sides, because it's very easy to choose one of them. You defend the rights of the minorities, but you can be put in a wrong position. You remember with the process of mutilation of women in some countries of Africa. It was a battle for me, completely no sense, that people trying to argue in favor of the human rights, but some others try to defend the practical because it was cultural. We cannot go against. For me, it was not the case to choose one side. It was meanable in the sense the culture have to obey or have to submit it to a more, maybe a more universal consideration. And I think we are only making this pendulum movement to go to the local for the global for the local, and it depends the moment. We are more on the one side and on the others. For that reason, that for me this is the important question. I think you want to make your point. Only just take this microphone, it's better.
This question is very interesting and up to date. My view is that we are being crushed by the globalization and neoliberalism, because some years ago we had a few multilateral companies that worked all around the world. Now, any company tries to do that, but the big companies control the system. So my view is that we are fighting against a sort of a crushing phenomena, and I think it's very difficult to see how the local initiatives, the local communities can face this problem. The only way I see is kind of a global revolution. Since we are global, for example, in Brazil, we have all the press, we have the TV Globo, that controls all the information that is given to the people. The local initiatives in the Northeast here are being crushed. Everyone tries to repeat what it sees in Globo. If you go to any office in São Paulo, you arrive there, and if you are sitting, you are seeing Globo. So it's very difficult to find this situation. Some signs I see is that with the revolts in Chile and Colombia, Chile is the main example, because there, after the dictatorship of Pinochet, which was a tremendous, harsh dictatorship, there was imposed a new liberal economic system. And we were told, we read in the press, that it was marvelous, that was liberating the country. And now we see that it was fake, it was a complete failure. So what I think is that the collapse from the top may help, but from below we can do nothing.
And other question? I make my two questions together. Okay, then let's finish. I'd like to thank you all to be here today, and very close to the Christmas celebrations. And I hope we can have some following ups from this seminar, the cycle of this seminar. Me and Naumar, we are starting to discuss the possibility to make a kind of publication of all the speech, all the seminars that was made here, to give the chance for the people to follow a little bit the discussion. And thank you very much to be here. I can offer in the name of Pina that bring us a very tasteful cake and take some coffees and still continues to make the small discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tanya, for to be here. It was a pleasure. Thank you.